Hey everyone, it's Nick from Sonic Tone Amps. Today in this video, we're going to go over presence and resonance and how they work in conjunction with the negative feedback loop. We're going to talk about EQs and the tone stack. And for a little bonus content, we're going to talk about the tone cut that's available on the Sonic Tone RC30. So what prompted me to do this video is I was reading on the internet in some different forums and threads, people asking how presence and resonance works. And some people were answering fairly correctly, some people were off the mark a little bit. So I'm going to try to set the record straight here and help explain how they work. With that, we're also going to talk about the tone stacks, like I said, and then the tone cut on the RC30. So let's dive in and get into the makeup of the amp and the different components that work with all of these things. An RC filter is a circuit composed of resistors and capacitors configured in such a way that forms a specific frequency filter that blocks certain frequencies and allows others to pass. Commonly, RC filters are arranged to either create high-pass filters, allowing only high frequencies to pass, or low-pass filters, allowing only low frequencies to pass. The values of the components determine the cutoff frequency, which is the point at which the filter starts to block frequencies from passing. All right, let's take a look at tone stacks and the equalization they provide. What we have here is a cool little desktop app called the Tone Stack Calculator made by Duncan Amplification. You can get a copy of this at duncanamps.com/TSC. It's a really useful tool for playing with the components and their values and seeing what different settings produce what different results and how it affects the sound wave itself. It starts off with the first tab is just a stock Marshall tone stack, and you can sit here and you can play with the different components. R1 here is your common slope resistor. C1 is your treble capacitor. Then you have your mid and bass capacitors here, and then of course potentiometers of treble, bass, and mid. So for example, one of the most common things to do is to change the value of the slope resistor, which is 33K in a stock Marshall tone stack. So if we were to increase that to something like 56K, you're going to see that you're going to lose a little bit of mids. Increasing the value of that's going to scoop the mids a little more. If we raise the bass up and lower the mids, you can see how drastic the mids are scooped out of what was once a stock Marshall tone stack. If we were to increase this back to the 33K stock value, you can see how all the mid content comes back. Another common modification to make is to change the treble capacitor, the C1, typically a 500 picofarad value. If we were to change that to 250 picofarad, we're going to change the amount of upper mid content. It's going to make the amp a little brighter and glassier, a little more still mid scoop, but again, it's more about the upper mids at this point. You're losing some of this slope here in the uppers above the 1K mark here. Again, if we change that back to the stock value, 500, you see how much of that upper mid comes back with the treble pot. Again, you got to realize that a EQ is essentially a passive filter network of several RC filters tied together, working together. You know, if the EQ is all up at 10, you're getting kind of full signal there coming through, not a whole lot of effect happening from an EQ standpoint. You start to pull things down, like the treble here, you're going to start to lose the highs, the bass, the mids, you know, and you start to tailor your sound. If you brought everything down, it gets a little silly with the hump there, but, you know, most people don't do that. Now, another thing to note is Marshall has a certain impedance. That's what this is right here. And it's expecting a certain impedance to come in. And that's usually because, not to get technical, it's coming typically from a cathode follower where the signal is coming off the cathode of the previous tube stage. And that helps match the impedance better to the tone stack. And so you have less signal loss because of that, because of the impedance being matched better. For example, we switch over to the Fender, it's expecting a higher impedance, we've got more signal loss. So Fender will have a tone stack typically maybe earlier in the preamp coming in with a higher impedance or more of an impedance mismatch, you're getting some signal loss, and there'll be a tube stage after the tone stack to make up that gain that was lost. But you can see here the slope value, the slope resistor value is 100K, so it's pretty significant, and you got a pretty big mid dip there, mid scoop. You know, we could bring this up to a Marshall style value of 33K, and it gets a little crazy. You get those mids back, it starts to flatten out. You got a lot of bass in there because of the way that the bass cap is. It's pretty high. We brought that down to a Marshall value. We're going to lose some bass there. Now it becomes, now we're basically turning it into more of a Marshall tone stack. But we're going to take that bass cap back up to its value. That's why Fenders are known to be pretty thick sounding, pretty bassy. These are the stock values of a lot of Fender amps. It might be a 56K in here instead of 100K. You know, a little more mid content. But that's what you're looking at. The difference between a Fender and a Marshall tone stack. It's pretty interesting. You know, again, let's go all the way up with the 10s here. Let's move this back to a stock value of 100K. If you notice, the C1 treble cap is a 250. Again, that's helping give you a little less of that upper mid content, a little more sparkly highs. It's a pretty big mid scoop there by comparison to the Marshall, right? So we bring that down to a more normal EQ. Still pretty good mid scoop there, which is more common to a Fender tone stack. What we have here is a very basic and simple block diagram of an amplifier. It may look familiar if you've watched the negative feedback video that I've done, but if you haven't seen that, check it out in the link in the description below. But just a quick recap, negative feedback is taking a signal from the secondary tap of the output transformer, which is out of phase of the signal going into the power amp, and combining them together to extend and flatten the frequency response and just in general overall tighten up the amp. Presence and resonance cannot work without the negative feedback loop and work in tandem with the negative feedback to perform the functions they perform. Now, it's going to seem a little weird and a little counterintuitive when I lay this out and what they're actually doing, but remember, we are dealing with an out-of-phase signal that's opposite of the signal that it's being combined with. So keep that in mind as I tell you that the resonance pot, which is usually before the negative feedback resistor, is taking the capacitor that is paired with, forming an RC filter, and creating a high-pass filter that's letting highs through and filtering out low-end frequencies. Which you might go, wait a minute, that's the opposite of what a resonance pot appears to do. As you turn it up, it thickens the amp up and reduces the high-end frequency. But remember, it's an out-of-phase signal, so by letting the highs through, those are the ones that are going to get canceled out, and by cutting the lows out, those are the ones that are going to be preserved and saved and not canceled out by the out-of-phase signal. So again, it's sort of an opposite effect. The presence pot does the same thing but flipped. It, with its capacitor in a certain configuration, forms a low-pass filter which cuts out the highs and allows the lows through. Again, what this does with the out-of-phase signal of the negative feedback is letting the lows through for them to be canceled out, and by removing the highs out of the signal, it's allowing the highs to be preserved so that they appear in the signal going into the power amp. So as you turn the presence pot up, you hear it get brighter with more highs and the lows get filtered out. So that's an overview of what these features do in regard to the negative feedback loop. For some bonus material, there are amps that don't have a negative feedback loop, so therefore cannot have a presence or resonance knob. But they do offer alternatives, typically in the form of something like a tone cut, which is available on the Sonic Tone Royal Crown 30 or RC30. That is an amp that does not have a negative feedback loop. So what does a tone cut do and how is it different? Let's dive into that. To dive into it, we got to dig into the power amp and take a closer look at the different components that make up the power amp. The very first thing is the phase splitter, which is typically a single tube like a 12AX7, which is two tubes in one, it's two triodes in one, and they take the input and then split it out into two out-of-phase signals that get then processed by the rest of the power amp. From there, the signal is then fed into the power tubes, which then feed the output transformer on so down the line. But before the two out-of-phase signals get to the power tubes, the tone cut pot and capacitor are connected together, forming an RC filter that works the two out-of-phase signals together. As you turn it up, it reduces the highs in the signal, so it forms a low-pass filter or high cut. It's a more simple implementation to achieve something similar as resonance and presence, but it's done in this way because there is no negative feedback loop. So that about wraps up the topics of this video, from presence and resonance and everything else we covered in between. I hope this video helped you to better understand them. Please check back here for more videos as we upload them to our YouTube channel. And thanks for stopping by. We'll see you soon.